Hello and welcome to the CU Catecast. I'm Father Ryan Humphries. Our topic this week is the Book of Jonah. Now, the story of Jonah is wonderful, and it's a wonderful break from the dire and often hard to relate to minor prophets we've had so far. Other than a handful of those parts of Daniel and a little bit of Ezekiel, we have been mostly wading through prophecies of woe, as well as a sense of here are a bunch of people who deserve to just get the bad end of the stick from the Lord. It's been a relatively depressing series of books. And although Jonah is only 4 chapters long, it has a lot to say, and plenty of important people are going to name drop Jonah in the Bible, including Tobit and Jesus himself. Now, those mentions, in fact, are going to give us some help in dating the book to the mid-5th century BC. It must have been written by the time Tobit talked about it, which feels logical enough, which means that was in the 4th century BC. Now, this is where the scholars, and I'm just going to default to the scholars, will take over, and they say that the Hebrew, the particular way that the Hebrew is written, is similar to the Hebrew of Ezra and Nehemiah, which you'll remember from talks on those two topics, or those two authors, would have been the mid-400s BC, about 450 BC. And so that's what we have. Now, as for the author, we're given the name of the prophet Jonah in verse 1:1. Now, if you've read Jonah, you don't get the sense that Jonah is writing this book himself. You just get the sense that there's some outside narrator who is telling the story of it, which is itself, you have to take a moment and stop and go, how did an outside narrator know that Jonah was in the belly of the fish? Or did the outside narrator travel with him? Was he telling this story later? Now, given the almost comic way in which Jonah writes about himself, like a teenage girl, on her MySpace page, I just want to die. Oh, it's all so terrible. Oh. You get this kind of whiny sort of tone where you get the idea that Jonah probably would have bemoaned this facts to anybody with ears for decades on. And you almost get the sense that he's doing this because he feels like he doesn't want to be to blame, quote unquote, for the Ninevites, the Babylonians, not being destroyed, which I can, understand. Anyone who's ever held a grudge or has a resentment against someone who's like, I don't want to be the person that forgave this person. I don't want to be the person who made sure that something good happened to this person because they're a jerk. And you get the same sort of thing where Jonah does not want to be in any way involved with helping the people from Nineveh. And so we don't really know who the author of the book is. It is not written in the first person, and we just kind of are guessing. We call it the Book of Jonah for obvious reasons. It's the only name associated with it, but we don't know anything else about this cat Jonah other than that he was a prophet and did his thing, which is not unusual. As you remember from the other prophets we've done, in often cases, that's all we know is that this prophet was this prophet. Now, theme-wise, Jonah is about God's compassion for all of us, especially the Gentiles. Now, that's a big innovation. The Jewish people were not big fans of that. They were the chosen people. And so the idea that the Lord is going to reach out and look after the Gentiles or the Greeks, that's not something that would have sat very well with the Jews, certainly not in the 450s BC. Maybe you could get away with something like that much, much, much later by the time we're getting to the Book of Wisdom, for example. And you could say, okay, you can kind of get a sense of like this, there were Jews living all in these Greek parts of the world, and they are the chosen people, but God is good, and you can kind of start to understand that. But Jonah digs into this much, much, much earlier. And we have to remember, too, Jonah's writing this only a generation or two after the end of the Babylonian exile, right? The Babylonian exile begins in 587 BC. It ends somewhere in the 530s BC. And so we're looking at 70 years later, which means that that Jonah's grandparents would have remembered the experience of the exile. And so this is not the ideal moment for God loves those people who enslaved us too, didn't he? I mean, it's hard to get with. And you could almost almost feel like if you take your head back to Moses, how badly it would have gone over if Moses had been talking about how the Egyptians deserve better than what they're getting after they just enslaved us and we just finally got away from them. That didn't play very well. And so we have the same sort of thing happening here and now, which gives us some insight into why Jonah is constantly bemoaning his job of being the guy that's preaching this wildly unpopular message. But the theme of God's love beyond the chosen people is especially relevant for us as Christians and for non-Jewish Christians, because that's something that really should hit us very hard. And so regardless of the context, the theme of Jonah is very uplifting, and I think it's a big part of the reason that it constantly shows up in those highlighted books of the Old Testament. In addition to the fact that there's a giant whale involved and a fish that eats people, and that plays well with children's Bibles. Now, Jonah is bizarre for a few reasons beyond the fish. One, he's unique among the prophets because he doesn't do any, like prophesying. We never actually get any prophecy in the book of Jonah. We have some stories about him saying some dire things, but there are no oracles. There's no clarity about why it is that God's coming to destroy them. There's no sense at all of why it's 28 days or 1 month, depending on the translation. We don't get any of that. We just have the fact that he's out there preaching woe, wearing the sandwich board, saying the end is nigh, and the Ninevites get on board with it, and Jonah hates that. So we don't actually have any prophecy from the prophet Jonah, which is itself a little interesting. The book comes across more like an authorized biography of a prophet, like a VH1 behind the music, than it does an actual book of prophecy. Still, the basic story we should all have some knowledge of. Jonah's called to be a prophet, but he is called to be a prophet in the worst possible place with the worst possible message, the capital of his enslavers. And whereas St. Patrick of Shamrock fame, whereas St. Patrick was zealous to go back to the people who enslaved him and convert them for love of Jesus, Jonah is not into it. And in fact, he is bickering almost in a comic way about not wanting to do it. So he flees on a ship. The ship goes out into the water. He's got all these pagan sailors on it. And then Jonah hints that he has been complaining nonstop about the fact that his God has called him to do something he doesn't want to do, and he's running away from it. Then the storm comes up, and the pagans all look around and they're praying and they say, Jonah, you're running away from a prophecy. You already told us that before, but what's the deal? And so Jonah basically says, well, just throw me in the water and I'll drown. That's better for me than you guys drowning, and it's better for me than having to go preach this stupid message in Nineveh. Well, Jonah gets thrown into the water, and inexplicably he manages to be eaten by a giant fish of some sort. We don't know how this plays out. The language is not in any way helpful. It doesn't use whale. It doesn't use a metaphorical kind of word like he was, trapped inside, say, a floating piece of wreckage. None of that. We just have the idea of a big fish that, quote, vomited it up on dry land 3 days after he was eaten. However that plays out. Then Jonah finds himself at the doors of Nineveh and goes, well, blurg. And so he ultimately goes in and without any enthusiasm strolls through the city, which takes 3 days to walk across. And he strolls through the city going, in a month you're all going to die. And he kind of gets the sense he's actually kind of excited about that part of it. And then inexplicably, all of a sudden, the king of Nineveh, who is apparently a whole lot more interested in his salvation than Nebuchadnezzar or any of the other folks before him, are going, we got to get our act together. And so everybody fasts, everybody repents. Again, we have no idea what they're repenting of. We just know that they're repenting. And then the whole thing goes well, and the Ninevites are saved. And now you have Jonah, who sets up shop on the corner of town, builds himself a little tent, hoping the whole place is going to be destroyed. And he's looking around and going, well, they're not dying. And you get the sense he's really upset about it. And then the Lord causes this tree to grow up, as in a very metaphorical sort of way. And then the tree immediately gets a worm and falls down or dies down. And then, Jonah puts on his best 1980s kind of upstairs, downstairs, British TV shows. Oh, Reginald, I'll just sit here and die, I think. And the Lord looks at him and goes, you just got to get your act together. You're ridiculous, and you need to stop being ridiculous. Thank you very much. And then the book abruptly ends. And it really is comical. I mean, there are moments where there's these tiny little phrases where you like when they're on the sailing ship, and they all threw him over because they knew what he had done, that he was running from a prophecy because he had told them. You know, you get this sense that like over and over again, the author of this book is really trying to kind of swat around Jonah, who is clearly a bit of a wet blanket and just seems to cause, lots of trouble. And then at the end of the book, you kind of have this moment, and then you feel like they should just cue the theme music, and Desi and Lucy will come out, give us a couple of good bows, and run off and get ready for the next skit. It's wonderfully bizarre. Now, the question of, did Jonah happen? Was it a real history, or is this a metaphor or an analogy sort of thing? And the reality is we don't know. Now, 100%, everyone at the time of Jesus considered the book of Jonah as historical fact. Up through the 1800s, everybody considered the book of Jonah historical fact. Now, as with all the history books of the Bible, everyone knew that there had been some poetic license taken, right? We all knew that there was some poetic license with all the history books of the Bible. That's fine. But there was no question that when Jesus mentioned the sign of Jonah, when he's talking about his own 3 days of darkness in the tomb, that everybody hearing him thought that Jonah was a real historical personage, and perhaps that he was a real historical personage who was well-known, beloved, ornery, and maybe had created some, little bit of myth and legend around himself. You could think like the way we think about Ben Franklin. Did Ben Franklin actually go out in a storm with a kite and a key? We don't really know, but that's kind of the story he told about himself, and it's a good story, and so why not roll with it? And so the question of Jonah and the fish, we just don't know, but there's no question whatsoever that at the time of Jesus, everybody believed that 100% of the book of Jonah was a real historical thing. Nowadays, the mostly liberal world of biblical theology insists on reducing everything to non-historical parable. I had a professor in seminary, it's the stupidest thing ever, said, well, the Red Sea should be better translated as the Reed Sea. And they didn't actually cross the Red Sea on dry land, they crossed the sea of wheat reeds on, just because there had not been rain and it was a swampland. And I'm going, what kind of moron are you? But this is something that's common nowadays. It's called historical critical analysis, and it's something that liberal biblical scholars do to try to, quote, demythologize or remove basically the spiritual life. It's what happens when you stop believing in God, and you still want to be religious. You end up with this kind of nonsense. And so that's where a lot of the modern issue with it comes. But reality is, in all of history, it was considered to be historical fact without any question whatsoever. And so either way, whether it is historical fact or not, is kind of a moot point for us because the message of it is incredibly potent. The message is that God is interested in all parties, not just the chosen people, that the Lord is reaching out to all parties, not just the chosen people, but that the Lord is going to use the chosen people as his instrument when he reaches out. All of those messages good and relevant for us as Christians. At its core, the book of Jonah is a call for the Jews to set aside their hatred and resentment and to acknowledge that God is God, which is a lesson that I think all of us can take and be appreciative of. And so Jonah's a lot of fun. You could have read it 4 times over just in the 10 minutes it took me to give this talk. It's a great book. It's a lot of fun, and I hope that you'll give it a read. And if you have any kind of or I should say that it's just a pleasant thing for you. It's a lot of fun and an excellent book. And it's the 7th to last book of the Old Testament. We're not going to have a whole lot of other fun ones like this before we make our way out into the New Testament, where we will be weighed down to a certain degree by a lot of complexity that will make these talks a little bit harder to get into. And so that's the CU Catecast for today. I'm Father Ryan Humphries. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and we'll see you again next time.